She woke up alone and scared, wondering why her mom hadn't come home. He helped the little girl, and what seemed like just a chance encounter unearths countless painful secrets. And in finding what she's lost, the past comes with a price too high to ignore. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. And now, on with the story. At 6:45 a.m., the cell phone vibrated on the marble countertop, a warning that cut through the silence. Richard Miller was on the treadmill in the private gym of his Manhattan penthouse, sweat dripping down his forehead, earbuds in, when he saw his daughter's name light up the screen. Beatrice, 8 years old. She never called at this hour. His heart started pounding before he even answered. He wiped his hand on a towel, took out an earbud, and swiped his finger across the screen. The voice on the other end wasn't the cheerful little voice that usually asked him to pick her up from school or told him about her math test. It was a trembling, choked voice, filled with a fear far too big for such a small body. "Daddy, Mommy didn't come home." Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. He shut off the treadmill in a sudden move, nearly losing his balance. Beatrice was crying on the other end of the line, trying to speak between sobs, explaining that her mum had gone out the night before, saying she'd be right back, that it was just a quick trip out. But the clock had passed midnight, then 1 in the morning, and she hadn't returned. The little girl was at Mrs. Lewis's place, the neighbor from the next apartment, a retired woman who had taken her in when Beatrice knocked on her door in the middle of the night, crying and shaking. Richard tried to keep his voice steady, but inside he was falling apart. He told his daughter he was on his way, that everything would be okay, that Mommy must have just gotten held up. But as he spoke, a terrible feeling grew in his chest. Jennifer, his ex-wife, would never do this. She would never leave Beatrice alone all night. Something was very wrong. He hung up, threw the phone into the pocket of his shorts, and went straight to his bedroom. He changed in less than 3 minutes, grabbed the keys to his BMW, and left the penthouse with his heart hammering against his ribs. The streets of New York were still empty on that Sunday morning, and as he drove toward Queens, where Jennifer lived with their daughter, Richard found himself drowning in memories he had tried to bury for 3 years. The divorce hadn't been an explosion. It had been a slow, silent, painful erosion. They had been happy once, a long time ago, when Richard was still an up-and-coming entrepreneur, working hard to build the chain of luxury fitness centers that now made him a millionaire. Jennifer had been by his side, pregnant with Beatrice, dreaming of a happy family, of weekends in the park, dinners at home, and bedtime stories. But success had come at a price. Richard started working 12, 14 hours a day. Meetings, business trips, grand openings, events. He thought he was doing it all for them, that providing comfort and security was the same as providing love. Jennifer held down the fort alone. She took care of Beatrice alone. She waited alone. And when she couldn't stand waiting anymore, she asked for a divorce. Richard hadn't fought it. He hadn't begged. He had signed the papers, arranged the child support, and moved on, convinced it was for the best. But now, driving through the deserted streets of New York, he realized he had been lying to himself the whole time. He had never moved on. He had only pretended to. He reached Jennifer's building 20 minutes later. It was an old 4-story walk-up with peeling paint on the walls. Richard ran up the stairs, knocked on the neighbor's door, and Mrs. Lewis opened it almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting. She was a woman in her 70s, with white hair in a bun, a floral apron, and a tired but welcoming look in her eyes. Beatrice was sitting on the living room sofa, hugging a worn-out teddy bear Richard had given her years ago, one of his many attempts to make up for his absence with gifts. When the girl saw her father, she ran and threw herself into his arms, sobbing loudly, clutching his shirt as if he might disappear too. "Daddy, where is she? Where's Mommy?" Richard hugged his daughter tightly, his chest aching. He didn't know what to say, he didn't know what to do. He only knew he had to find Jennifer, and fast. Mrs. Lewis made some coffee and told him what she knew. The night before, around 9 o'clock, a man had shown up at Jennifer's door. He was well dressed in a dark suit, but he had a grim air about him, a heavy presence. Mrs. Lewis had overheard their conversation from the hallway. The man said something about time being up, about settling things once and for all. Jennifer turned pale, started pacing back and forth, nervously fiddling with her phone. Half an hour later, she got dressed in a hurry, a dark dress, high heels, strong perfume, and left with the man. She left Beatrice alone. Richard felt anger rise in his throat. How could Jennifer have done that? How could she have left their daughter alone in the middle of the night? But at the same time, he knew Jennifer would never do that without a very serious reason. She loved Beatrice more than anything. If she had left like that, it was because she was scared. Scared of what? Of whom? He thanked Mrs. Lewis, picked Beatrice up and went to Jennifer's apartment. He had a spare key, kept since the divorce, that he'd never used. He opened the door and walked in, feeling a tightness in his chest as he saw the state of the place. The apartment was small, a one-bedroom with an open kitchen and a tiny bathroom. But it wasn't the size that was shocking, it was the neglect. A burnt-out light bulb in the hallway, a water stain on the living room ceiling, a sign of a leak, exposed electrical wires behind the refrigerator, old, worn-out furniture, barely holding on to its dignity. Richard looked around and felt a deep sense of shame. How had he not seen this before? How had he let the mother of his child live like this? Beatrice asked to take a shower. Richard helped her, got her clean clothes, and made a makeshift breakfast with what was in the fridge. He didn't know how to cook, he'd never had to, but he managed. He made pancakes that came out lopsided and burnt around the edges, but Beatrice ate them anyway, in silence, poking at them with her fork, staring at her plate with a heart-wrenching sadness. Suddenly she looked up and asked the question Richard wasn't expecting. "Dad, why did you two break up?" He swallowed hard. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that adults make mistakes, that they hurt each other, that they choose the wrong path? He sat down next to her, held her small hand, and spoke carefully. "B, sometimes people love each other, but they can't live together. Your mum and I loved each other very much, but we got lost along the way. I worked too much, your mum was lonely, and we just stopped understanding each other. It wasn't anyone's fault, it was just sad." The little girl was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she asked the question that hurt even more. "Do you still love Mommy?" Richard felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at his daughter, at those big, frightened eyes, and realized there was no point in lying, not to her, not to himself. "I do, Bea, I love your mum, and I never stopped." Beatrice started crying again, but this time it was a different kind of cry, a cry of relief mixed with guilt. "Then it was my fault, Dad. Mommy's suffering because of me. I ask for a lot of things for school, expensive supplies, a new uniform, and she gets worried. I hear her crying in her room at night. She thinks I don't hear her, but I do." Richard felt his chest explode. He hugged his daughter tightly, whispering that nothing was her fault, that she was the most important thing in the world, that grown-up problems weren't a child's responsibility. But inside, he was crumbling. Beatrice had learned to blame herself for her parents' mistakes. She had learned to swallow her tears so she wouldn't be a bother. She had learned to be a grown-up far too soon. After Beatrice calmed down, Richard left her with Mrs. Lewis again and went out to look for Jennifer. He needed clues. He needed to understand what was happening. He went back to the apartment and started searching everywhere. He opened drawers, cabinets, looked under the bed, inside the closet. And he found it on the nightstand in the bedroom, an envelope full of overdue bills. Bills that were months past due, shut-off notices for the electricity, the water, credit card statements with absurd interest rates, and a small blue-covered notebook filled with frantic notes. Loan, final deadline, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000. The more he read, the more his heart sank. Jennifer was in debt, deep in debt, and she had turned to someone she shouldn't have. Richard went back to the living room, sat on the sofa, and ran a hand over his face, trying to think. The man in the suit who had shown up last night, the notes about a final deadline. Jennifer leaving in a hurry, dressed as if for an important meeting, but with fear in her eyes. It was all starting to make a horrible kind of sense. She had borrowed money. She couldn't pay it back, and now she was paying for it in another way. Richard felt the anger return, But this time it wasn't directed at her. It was at himself. He had everything. More money than he knew what to do with. He could have helped. He could have asked. He could have been there. But pride had gotten in the way. Both of their prides. Jennifer was too proud to ask for help, and he was too proud to offer. He picked up his phone and called Jennifer. Voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called 10 times. Nothing. He left the apartment and went to Jennifer's workplace, a women's clothing store at the Queen Center Mall. The manager, a middle-aged woman named Sonia, confirmed what he already suspected. Jennifer hadn't shown up for work, and it wasn't like her to be a no-show without calling. "She's been acting strange the last few weeks," Sonia said, crossing her arms and looking at Richard with concern. "Thinner, more on edge. She asked for a payroll advance twice, and on Friday, after a phone call, she ran to the bathroom and stayed in there crying for half an hour. I asked if everything was okay, but she said it was. I knew it wasn't, though." Richard thanked her and left the mall with a heavy heart. Jennifer had been suffering alone, and he hadn't seen it, hadn't noticed, because he was too busy building empires and forgetting that the only thing that mattered was crumbling right in front of him. He spent the rest of the morning going to places they used to frequent when they were still married. The bakery where they had Sunday breakfast, the park where they took Beatrice to play, the movie theatre where they saw their first film together. But all he found were echoes of a past that was gone for good. Until, in the middle of the afternoon, he walked into a quiet bar in Park Slope, a small simple place where Jennifer sometimes went for a juice after work. The owner, a friendly, heavy-set guy named Paul, recognized Richard right away. "You're Jennifer's ex-husband, right? I've seen her show Beatrice a picture of you here." Richard felt a lump in his throat. Jennifer still showed their daughter pictures of him, still talked about him, still remembered. "Paul, did she stop by here last night?" The bar owner nodded, but his face grew serious. "She did. Around 9:30. She came in looking nervous, sat in the back and just ordered water. She was on her phone the whole time, looking at the door, like she was waiting for someone. Then this guy in a suit shows up, well-dressed but with a look I didn't like. They talked, she started crying, he raised his voice. In the end, she left with him. But it didn't look like she wanted to. It looked like she left because she had no choice." Richard's blood ran cold. "Thanks, Paul. Do you remember anything else? Any detail?" The owner hesitated, then went to the bar and came back with a crumpled piece of paper. "I wrote down his license plate. The whole situation felt off, you know. Figured it might be useful." Richard took the paper and read the sequence of letters and numbers. He felt an immense gratitude for this simple man who had paid attention when no one else did. "You may have just saved her life, Paul." The bar owner gave a sad smile. "I hope so, son. I really hope so." Richard left the bar with a solid lead in his hand. He called an influential friend, someone who knew people, someone who knew how the world worked when the law was too slow. He gave him the license plate number and waited. Half an hour later, his phone rang. "Richard, that car belongs to a collection agency, but it's not one of the official ones, you know. It's a front. They offer easy loans to desperate people, charge insane interest rates, and when the person can't pay, they collect in other ways." Richard's stomach churned. "What ways?" "The ways you're imagining." He hung up the phone and stood frozen on the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the world crash down on his shoulders. Jennifer was in the hands of those people, and he had to get her out. Fast, he got the address of the so-called company. A small office in a commercial district in an outer borough, in an old run-down building. Richard walked up the stairs, knocked on the door, and entered without waiting for an answer. A man was sitting behind a desk, typing on a computer. He looked up, saw Richard, and smiled. A cold, calculated smile, the smile of someone used to dealing with desperation. "Can I help you?" Richard took a step forward, controlling his rage. "I'm looking for Jennifer Davis. She owes you money. I'm here to pay." The man tilted his head still, smiling. "Ah, Jennifer, of course. But her deadline has passed. Now she's providing services for us until the debt is settled. It's a fair arrangement." Richard clenched his fists. How much does she owe? The man opened a folder, pretended to consult some numbers, and then named an absurd figure inflated by predatory interest and made-up fees. Richard didn't blink. I'll pay it. Now. But I want her back immediately. The man leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and looked at Richard with that smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's not that simple. We have rules, procedures. Your money is welcome, but Jennifer will need to finish her shift today. She'll be free tomorrow. Richard slammed his fist on the desk, making the man jump in his chair. I didn't come here to negotiate. I came to get the mother of my child, and I'm leaving here with her one way or another. The man's smile vanished. He stared at Richard for a long moment, sizing him up, calculating. Then he sighed, picked up the phone and made a quick call. Fine, you can go get her. But you go alone and you don't ask questions, understood? Richard nodded. The man scribbled an address on a piece of paper and handed it to him. It's a warehouse in an industrial park. She's there. Richard took the paper and left without looking back. He got in his car, put the address into his GPS, and took off, his heart beating so hard it felt like it would explode. The industrial park was on the outskirts of the city, in a forgotten area where abandoned warehouses shared space with factories running night shifts. Richard drove for over 40 minutes following the GPS directions until he reached a set of low, lifeless buildings. The address the man had given him led to a warehouse at the end of a narrow street, surrounded by high walls and a faded sign that said nothing. Richard parked the car a few yards away and just sat there for a moment, trying to control his breathing. What was he going to find inside? What condition would Jennifer be in? His imagination started conjuring up worse and worse scenarios, and he had to close his eyes and force himself to think clearly. Panicking wouldn't help. He had to be strong. For her. For Beatrice. For all of them. He got out of the car and walked to the warehouse door. There was a bouncer at the entrance, a huge man with crossed arms and a bored expression. Richard showed him the paper with the address, and the bouncer just nodded, opening the door without a word. Inside, the reality was worse than Richard had imagined. The warehouse had been turned into a kind of makeshift nightclub with colored lights, loud music, and a bar in the back. There were tables scattered around the room, where men in suits and ties drank and laughed loudly, served by women in tight clothes and forced smiles. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, cheap perfume, and a poorly disguised atmosphere of desperation. Richard's stomach turned. This wasn't a workplace. It was a place where vulnerabilities were exploited, where dignity was bought and sold, where desperate people sank deeper and deeper just to try to survive. And Jennifer was here. He saw her across the room. She was serving drinks at a table full of men who were laughing loudly and making comments Richard couldn't hear but could imagine. Jennifer was wearing a short black dress she would never wear by choice, high heels and heavy makeup that couldn't hide her swollen eyes. She held the tray with trembling hands, forcing a smile that didn't come close to her eyes. Richard took a step forward, but stopped. If he went in there making a scene, he could make everything worse. He had to be smart. He waited for her to finish serving the table and turned to go back to the bar. That's when she saw him. Their eyes met across the room, and for a second, the world stopped. Jennifer froze, the tray nearly slipping from her hands. Her face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, relief, and then shame. A deep, crushing shame that made her look away and try to hide behind the bar. But Richard was already walking toward her. He crossed the room, ignoring the curious stares, ignoring the loud music, ignoring everything but getting to her. When he finally stood face to face with Jennifer, she had tears streaming down her face, smudging her makeup, and her voice came out in a desperate whisper. "Go away, Richard, for God's sake, just go away." He shook his head. "Not without you." Jennifer looked around, saw one of the bouncers approaching, and pulled Richard into a more secluded corner, away from prying eyes and ears. When she finally managed to speak, her voice was a mix of anger and despair. "You shouldn't have come here. I don't need your help. I solve my own problems." Richard felt the anger rise, but it wasn't at her. It was at the situation, the injustice, the world that had pushed Jennifer to this point. He gripped her shoulders firmly, forcing her to look him in the eye. "Jennifer, Beatrice stayed up all night waiting for you. She knocked on Mrs. Lewis's door in the middle of the night, crying, scared you were never coming back. Do you really think you can solve this alone?" Jennifer's face crumbled. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob, her whole body shaking. Richard pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly as she fell apart, years of pain and loneliness finally finding a release. "I didn't want you to see this," Jennifer whispered between sobs. "I didn't want anyone to see. I just wanted to fix the apartment, Richard, that's all. The ceiling was leaking. The wiring was old. I was afraid something would happen to B. I went to the bank. They denied the loan. Then this man showed up, said he could help me, that the interest was low, that it was easy, and I believed him. I was an idiot, and I believed him." Richard pulled her back just enough to look at her face, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "You weren't an idiot. You were desperate, and I should have been there to help you. But I wasn't, and that's my fault, not yours." Jennifer shook her head, trying to speak, but Richard didn't let her. "Listen, Jennifer, you're not staying here one more minute. I already paid your debt. You're free, and we're leaving here now together." "But they said I had to stay until tomorrow," Jennifer started, but Richard cut her off again. "I don't care what they said. You're coming with me now." One of the bouncers approached, but Richard stared him down with a firmness that made the man hesitate. He knew Richard had money, knew he had influence, knew it wasn't a good idea to start trouble with someone like him. The bouncer shrugged and went back to his post. Richard took Jennifer by the hand and led her to the exit. She followed in silence, still shaking, still processing what was happening. When they finally stepped out of the warehouse and the cool night air hit their faces, Jennifer took a deep breath as if she'd been trapped underwater and could finally breathe again. Richard opened the car door for her, waited for her to get in, and only then went to the driver's side. He started the car, put on some quiet music on the radio, an old song that used to play when they were still happy, and started driving back to the city. They were silent for a long time. Jennifer stared out the window, watching the city lights slowly get closer, and Richard drove with concentration, but his mind was in 1,000 places at once. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he needed to say, but he didn't know where to start. It was Jennifer who broke the silence. "Why did you do this?" Richard glanced at her, then turned his eyes back to the road. "Why do you think?" Jennifer shook her head. "I don't know. We've barely spoken in 3 years. You have your life, I have mine. You shouldn't have gotten involved in this." Richard gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Jennifer, you're the mother of my child. Did you really think I was going to let you handle a situation like this on your own?" Jennifer was quiet for a moment, then let out a bitter laugh. "You did, Richard. You've been letting me handle things on my own for a long time." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He knew she was right. He had. Not intentionally, not because he didn't care, but because he had been a coward. Because he had let his pride get the best of him. Because he thought child support was enough. That presence could be replaced by financial comfort. "I know," Richard said, his voice low. "I know I failed you, and there's no excuse for it. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again." Jennifer turned her head to look at him, surprised. "What do you mean by that?" Richard pulled the car over, turned off the engine, and turned to face Jennifer directly. He had to say it. He had to let out everything he'd been holding in for 3 years. "I never stopped loving you, Jennifer. Never. I pretended I was over it, pretended I was fine on my own, but it was a lie. I think about you every day. I wake up in the middle of the night and find myself wondering if you're okay, if you're happy, if you need anything. And today, when B called me saying you were gone, I felt like my world had ended. Because I realized I could actually lose you. And if that happened, it would be my fault, because I didn't fight for you. Because I let my work become more important than us. Because I was an idiot." Jennifer was crying again, but this time it was a different kind of cry. A cry of relief, of release, of emotions that had been trapped for too long. "I never stopped loving you either, Richard," she said, her voice trembling. I tried so hard, but I couldn't. Every time I looked at Bea and saw your eyes, I saw you. And it hurt. It hurt so much. Why didn't you call me? Richard asked. Why didn't you tell me you needed help? Jennifer wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Pride, I guess. I didn't want you to think I only came back because of the money. And I was afraid of hearing an "I told you so," you know? Of hearing that you were right, that I couldn't make it on my own. Richard took her hand and held it tightly. I would never say that, Jennifer. Never. You're the strongest woman I know. You raised our daughter practically by yourself. You worked, you studied, you did everything at once. You're incredible. And I was an idiot for not telling you that sooner. They stayed there, pulled over on the side of the road, holding hands, crying together for the first time in 3 years. And when they finally kissed, it was as if time had turned back, as if all the mistakes, all the pain, all the hurt had been erased in that single moment. They got back on the road in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, full of unspoken but understood promises. When they reached Jennifer's building, it was already past midnight. They walked up the stairs slowly, hand in hand, and when they entered the apartment, they found Beatrice asleep on Mrs. Lewis's sofa, her teddy bear clutched to her chest. Mrs. Lewis stood up when she saw them, relieved. Thank God you're back. The little one was so worried she wouldn't even sleep in her bed. Said she was going to wait for her mommy to come home. Jennifer carefully picked up her daughter, trying not to wake her, and carried her to the bedroom. Richard followed behind, thanked Mrs. Lewis, and closed the apartment door. He helped Jennifer put Beatrice to bed, tucked her in, and stood there for a moment, just watching his daughter sleep. She looked so small, Richard whispered. So fragile. Jennifer came closer and held his arm. She's strong, Richard. Stronger than we think. Richard looked at Jennifer and saw in her the same fragility, the same strength, and he realized he had wasted 3 years of his life away from the 2 people he loved most in the world. He wasn't going to waste another minute. If you were in Richard's shoes, would you have gone to get Jennifer, or would you have done something else? Let us know in the comments. They stood there for a while longer, just watching Beatrice sleep until Jennifer started to sway with exhaustion. Richard took her by the arm and led her to the living room. She sat on the sofa, still in the tight dress and smudged makeup, looking too tired to move. Go take a shower, Richard said gently. I'll stay here with Bea. I'm not going anywhere. Jennifer nodded and went to the bathroom. Richard heard the water running, heard her crying softly in the shower, and felt his chest tighten. She had held everything together on her own for so long that now that she finally had someone to share the pain with, she was falling apart. When Jennifer came out of the shower, wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, her face clean and her hair wet, she looked like a different person. Younger, lighter, more herself. She sat on the sofa next to Richard and rested her head on his shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Richard put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her closer. You don't have to thank me. I should have done this a long time ago. They stayed there, holding each other on the sofa, in silence until Jennifer fell asleep. Richard didn't move, afraid of waking her. He stayed there all night, holding her in his arms, feeling her weight against his chest, and thinking about everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. It had been a day that changed everything, a day that forced him to face his mistakes, his failures, his lies, a day that made him realize that money couldn't buy love, that success didn't fill loneliness, that presence was the only gift that truly mattered. When the sun began to rise, lighting up the room through the old torn curtains, Richard looked around the apartment and made a silent promise. He was going to fix all of this. He was going to fix the apartment. He was going to fix Jennifer's life. He was going to fix their family. Because he had learned the hard way that some things couldn't wait, that some people couldn't be left behind, that some chances don't come around again, and he wasn't going to waste the chance that fate had given him. Beatrice woke up early, as always, and came running into the living room still, in her pajamas. When she saw her dad there on the sofa, with her mum sleeping in his arms, she stopped and stared, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then, slowly, a huge smile spread across her face. Dad, you stayed, she said, her voice full of joy. Richard motioned for her to speak more quietly so as not to wake Jennifer. "I did, and I'm going to keep staying." Beatrice jumped onto the sofa and squeezed in between them, hugging her parents with all the strength a small body could muster. And there, in that modest apartment, on that old sofa with the sunlight streaming through the gaps in the curtains, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like he was finally home. The days that followed were strange, but in a good way. Richard cancelled all his meetings for the week, delegated responsibilities to the managers of his gyms, and decided that, for the first time in years, he was going to put his family first. He slept on the sofa in Jennifer's apartment, woke up early to make breakfast with Beatrice before school, walked her to the gate, and picked her up in the afternoon. At night, after the girl went to sleep, he and Jennifer would talk for hours, talking about everything they hadn't talked about in the last 3 years. It was a slow, delicate, careful reconstruction. It wasn't a fairy tale where everything was solved with a kiss. It was real, with all the difficulties that reality carried. There were moments of awkward silence, moments when the hurts of the past resurfaced, moments when they both had to take a deep breath and remember why they were trying again. But there were also good moments, spontaneous laughter, as they tried to cook together and burned the rice, glances that met and said more than 1,000 words. Beatrice running through the living room and jumping on both of them, asking them to play with her like they used to when she was little. And it was in those moments that Richard knew he was doing the right thing, that he was finally where he was supposed to be. The following Monday, Richard hired a contractor to do a full inspection of the apartment. The report came back and it was worse than he had imagined. The leak in the ceiling had compromised part of the structure. The electrical wiring was outdated and dangerous. There was water damage in the bathroom walls and the kitchen pipes were corroded. The contractor recommended an urgent renovation. Richard didn't hesitate. He hired a trusted crew, authorized all the necessary repairs, and told Jennifer that she and Beatrice could stay at his penthouse while the work was being done. Jennifer resisted at first, said she didn't want to be a bother, that they could stay with Mrs. Lewis, but Richard was firm. It wasn't a bother, it was rebuilding, and rebuilding required them to be together. The temporary move to the penthouse was a culture shock for Beatrice. She was enchanted by the size of the apartment, the view of the city, the rooftop pool, and the private gym. But what made her happiest wasn't the luxury. It was waking up every day and seeing her mom and dad having breakfast together. It was having both of them there at dinner time. It was being able to watch a movie on the giant living room sofa with her mom on one side and her dad on the other. Jennifer on the other hand felt out of place. She didn't belong in that world of marble and glass, of maids and amenities. She tried to help in the kitchen, but the cook already had everything organized. She tried to tidy up the bedroom, but the housekeeper had already done it. She felt useless, like an intruder in her own attempt at a new beginning. Richard noticed it one night when he found Jennifer on the balcony, looking out at the illuminated city with a sad expression. He sat next to her and was silent for a moment, just feeling her presence. "You're not happy here," he said. It wasn't a question. Jennifer sighed. "It's not that, I don't feel at home. Everything here is so perfect, so organized, so different from me." Richard took her hand. "Jennifer, this apartment isn't a home. It's a beautiful but empty place. You know where I've truly felt at home in the last 3 years? On that old sofa in your apartment, with you and Bea. That was a home." Jennifer looked at him, her eyes shining. "Then why didn't you sell this place and come live with us?" "Because I'm a proud idiot," Richard answered with a sad smile. "But I'm learning, and if you give me a chance, I'll prove to you that I can be less of an idiot." Jennifer laughed. It was her first genuine laugh since they had started talking again. And with that laugh, something shifted. The tension eased, a naturalness returned, and for the first time since they had separated, they were both able to relax in each other's presence. The weeks passed, and the apartment renovation was completed. The result surprised even Richard. The crew had done an impeccable job. The ceiling was new. The board wiring had been completely replaced, the pipes substituted, the walls painted, the floors redone. The apartment was unrecognizable. It was still small, still modest, but now it was safe, cozy, a true home. When Jennifer saw the result, she couldn't hold back her tears. It was more than a renovation. It was proof that Richard was serious, that he was investing not just money, but care, attention, presence. Beatrice was ecstatic. She ran from room to room, admiring everything, jumping on the new bed, testing the bedroom lights that now worked perfectly. And when she finally tired of exploring, she threw herself on the new sofa and said with the brutal honesty of children, the sentence that made Richard and Jennifer's hearts explode at the same time. "Now all we need is for Daddy to live here with us, and we'll be a family again." Richard and Jennifer looked at each other. Neither of them answered right away, but they both knew that sentence had planted a seed, a possibility, a future that once seemed impossible, but now somehow was starting to feel real. That night, after Beatrice went to sleep, Richard and Jennifer talked in the living room. The conversation started casually, about the day, about the girls' school, about plans for the weekend. But little by little it grew deeper, more honest, more vulnerable. "Do you regret marrying me?" Jennifer asked suddenly. Richard was surprised by the question. "Never. Not for a second." "Then why did you let us get divorced?" Richard took a deep breath. "Because I was scared. Scared of not being enough. Scared of failing. Scared that you'd realize you had chosen the wrong person. So I threw myself into my work, because at work I knew how to succeed. I knew how to win. But with you and B, I never knew if I was doing it right. And instead of asking, instead of trying, I ran away." Jennifer was silent for a long time, processing. Then she spoke, her voice low but firm. "I was scared too. Scared of not being enough. Scared that you'd look at me one day and realize I was just an ordinary woman, without glamour, without sophistication. Scared you'd get tired of me." Richard moved closer to her and held her face in his hands. "Jennifer, you were never ordinary. You're the most extraordinary person I know. And I was blind not to see that before." They kissed again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss. It was a kiss of a new beginning, of forgiveness, of promise. The following months were a period of adjustment. Richard didn't officially move back into Jennifer's apartment, but he spent most of his time there. He slept on the sofa some nights, went back to the penthouse on others, but he was always present, always available, always there. Jennifer went back to school. She had dropped out of her education program when Beatrice was born, but now Richard encouraged her to go back. He paid her tuition, helped with her schedule, and stayed with Beatrice when Jennifer had night classes. And slowly, Jennifer began to rediscover dreams she had buried long ago. Beatrice blossomed. Her grades improved. She started smiling easily again. She made new friends. Her teacher told Jennifer that the girl was more confident, more participative, and Jennifer knew why. For the first time in her life, Beatrice felt secure. Secure in the knowledge that she had a mother and a father who loved her. Secure that she wouldn't wake up one day to find that someone had disappeared. Mrs. Lewis watched everything from a distance, with the quiet smile of someone who has lived a long life and knows how to recognize when love is finding its way back. She always had a plate of cake ready for Beatrice, was always available for a chat with Jennifer, and always greeted Richard with a warm nod. She had become part of their patched-together family, a sort of adoptive grandmother, whom everyone loved and respected. It was on a Sunday afternoon, 6 months after that life-changing phone call, that Richard made his final decision. He was in the penthouse looking around the huge empty space, and he realized he didn't belong there anymore. That place represented everything he used to be. Ambitious, lonely, focused on the wrong things, but he wasn't that person anymore. He had changed, and it was time to truly leave the past behind. He called a real estate agency and put the penthouse up for sale. He wouldn't need it anymore. He didn't want it anymore. He wanted something smaller, something simpler, something he could call home, and he knew exactly where that home was. That night, he went to Jennifer's apartment with a small box in his pocket. The three of them had dinner together, as they had done so many times in recent months. Beatrice talked excitedly about a friend's birthday party. Jennifer commented on a college assignment, and Richard just sat there listening, absorbing, feeling a peace he didn't know was possible. After dinner, while Beatrice was brushing her teeth in the bathroom, Richard asked Jennifer to sit on the sofa. She obliged, curious, and he knelt in front of her, taking the small box out of his pocket. Jennifer's face went pale. "Richard, what are you doing?" "Jennifer Davis," Richard began, his voice trembling but firm, "I wasted 3 years of my life away from you. 3 years I can never get back, but I've learned from my mistakes. I've learned that money can't buy happiness. I've learned that success is worthless if you have no one to share it with. I've learned that presence is the only gift that truly matters, and I want to spend the rest of my life giving you that gift. I want to wake up next to you every day. I want to watch you study and achieve your dreams. I want to see B grow up with us together. I want to build a real home, not a beautiful empty house. I want you. Will you marry me again?" Jennifer was crying, her hands shaking, her eyes fixed on the box Richard was holding. She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't. She just nodded, her head bobbing frantically, tears streaming down her face. Richard placed the ring on her finger, a simple but beautiful ring, and pulled her into a tight hug. And that's when Beatrice came out of the bathroom, in her pajamas with her toothbrush in hand. Anne saw her parents hugging and crying. "What happened?" she asked, scared. Richard and Jennifer pulled apart and opened their arms to her. Beatrice ran and jumped in between them, and Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, "We're getting married again, Bea. We're going to be a family again." Beatrice screamed with joy so loudly that Mrs. Lewis knocked on the wall, but she was laughing too, because everyone on the floor had heard, and everyone was happy. The girl jumped around the living room singing that there was going to be a wedding, that she was going to be the flower girl, that she was going to wear a beautiful dress. And Richard, looking at Jennifer and Beatrice, felt that he had finally found what he had been searching for his whole life. It wasn't success, it wasn't money, it wasn't recognition. It was this. These two people, this love, this family. The wedding was simple, a small ceremony with a few guests. Mrs. Lewis was there, crying emotionally. Sonia, the manager from the store where Jennifer worked, was there. Paul, the bar owner who had written down the license plate and helped Richard find Jennifer, was there. And of course Beatrice was there, beautiful in a pink dress, holding the ring so carefully, it was as if she were carrying a treasure. When Richard and Jennifer exchanged their vows, they weren't memorized or rehearsed. They were words from the heart, real promises, true commitments. And when the justice of the peace said they could kiss, the kiss was sealed with applause and tears of joy from everyone present. The reception was in their own apartment, with homemade food, simple music, and lots of laughter. There was no luxury, no extravagance, but there was something much more valuable. There was love. There was presence. There was family. At night, after everyone had gone home and Beatrice had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from all the excitement, Richard and Jennifer stood on the small apartment balcony, looking up at the starry New York sky, holding each other in silence. "Do you have any regrets?" Jennifer asked suddenly. Richard laughed. "About what?" "About giving up the penthouse, the luxury, everything, to come live in a small apartment with us." Richard pulled her closer and kissed her forehead. "Jennifer, I didn't give up anything. I gained everything. I gained you. I gained B. I gained a family. This," he gestured to encompass the small apartment, "is more than I could have ever dreamed of." Jennifer smiled and rested her head on his chest. "I love you, Richard. I love you too. I always have, and I always will." And there, in that modest apartment, on that small balcony, under that starry sky, Richard Miller finally understood the meaning of wealth. It had nothing to do with money. It had to do with being where you belong, with being with who you love, with having what truly matters. And for the first time, in a very long time, he felt truly rich. The following years were about building, not the fast, artificial building Richard knew from the business world, but the slow, solid building of a family that had been broken and was now mending itself, piece by piece, day by day. Richard sold half of his gyms and started working less, not because he didn't like what he did, but because he had learned that balance was essential. He reserved his mornings to take Beatrice to school, his afternoons for work, and his evenings to be with his family. On weekends, he didn't answer work calls. Those were sacred days, reserved for trips to the park, long lunches, and movies on the sofa. Jennifer graduated with honors. Richard was in the audience on graduation day, holding Beatrice on his lap, even though she was already too big for it, crying with pride as Jennifer walked across the stage to receive her diploma. She got a job at a public school, working with children from vulnerable families, and there she found the purpose she had been searching for her whole life. She came home every day with stories, with challenges, with that sparkle in her eyes of someone who was making a difference in the world. Beatrice grew up. She was no longer that scared 8-year-old who had stayed up all night waiting for her mother. She became a smart, inquisitive preteen, full of opinions and dreams. She wanted to be a doctor. She wanted to help people. And Richard knew exactly where that desire to care for others came from. It came from her mother, who had spent her life caring for her alone. It came from her father, who had learned too late that caring was more important than providing. It was on a Saturday afternoon, 2 years after the wedding, that their lives took another turn. Jennifer hadn't been feeling well for a few days. She was tired, nauseous, irritable. Richard insisted she see a doctor, and when the test results came back, they were both in shock. Jennifer was pregnant. They hadn't planned it. They were older now. Beatrice was already 10, and life was finally settled. But after the initial shock wore off, joy set in. An immense, transformative joy. Beatrice was thrilled with the news. She was going to have a little brother or sister. She spent weeks picking out names, drawing pictures to decorate the baby's room, making plans. And whenever someone asked if she was jealous, she answered with that brutal honesty that never left her. Jealous of what? Now we're going to be an even bigger family. Before, I just had Mum and Dad. Now I'll have a baby too. It's way better. The pregnancy was smooth. Jennifer had morning sickness, her mood swung, her belly grew, but she was radiant. Richard didn't miss a single prenatal appointment. He was there for every ultrasound, every test, every moment. And when they found out it was a boy, he cried. He was going to have a son, a boy to raise, to teach, to be there for from day one. They decided to name the baby Gabriel. Jennifer chose the name because it meant messenger, and she felt that this baby was indeed a message that it was never too late to start over, that mistakes could be corrected, that families could be rebuilt. Mrs. Lewis knitted blankets and little outfits. Sonia organized a baby shower at the store. Paul had a huge cake made with "Welcome Gabriel" written in blue icing. The small community that had formed around their family was celebrating with them, growing with them. But it wasn't all perfect. A few weeks before the due date, something happened that brought the past back in an unexpected way. Richard was leaving work when a black car pulled up beside him in the parking garage. The window rolled down, and the face that appeared was a ghost he had tried to forget. It was the man who had collected Jennifer's debt, the one who had taken her to that warehouse, the one Richard had paid to free her. The man smiled, that same cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Richard, isn't it? Long time no see." Richard's blood ran cold. "What do you want?" The man shrugged. "Just came to give you a heads up. You took a good client from me back then. Jennifer was, let's say, a valuable asset, and I don't like losing assets." Richard clenched his fists. "She doesn't owe you anything. I paid it all, with interest. You have nothing to do with her anymore." The man laughed. "True, but you know how it is. Business is business. And I thought maybe you'd want to invest in a new opportunity. I've got some interesting proposals, things that could make you a lot of money." Richard took a step forward, his voice low but full of menace. "I don't do business with people like you, and if you come near my family again, I guarantee you'll regret it." The man's smile faded. "Careful with the threats, Richard. You have a lot to lose now. A pregnant wife, a daughter, an apartment. It would be a shame if something happened." Richard felt his anger explode, but he controlled himself. He knew reacting with violence was exactly what this Man wanted. He took out his phone, snapped a picture of the car, the license plate, the man's face, and said, calmly but firmly, "I have connections. I have resources. I have lawyers. And I have evidence of everything you did. If you or anyone associated with you comes near my family, I will use all of it to destroy you. Understand?" The man looked at Richard for a long moment, sizing him up. Then he gave a forced smile, rolled up the window, and drove away. But Richard knew this wasn't over. People like that never gave up easily. He went home with a heavy heart, but decided not to tell Jennifer anything. She was pregnant, she needed peace, not worry. But he beefed up their security. He hired a doorman for the building. He installed cameras in the hallway. He asked a trusted friend to keep an eye out for any strange activity. And for the next few weeks he was hypervigilant. He took Beatrice to school and picked her up personally. He didn't let Jennifer go out alone. He checked the cameras several times a day. He was exhausted, but he wasn't going to let his guard down. Not when he had so much to lose. Jennifer noticed something was wrong. "You're acting strange, Richard," she said one night, sitting up in bed with her huge belly, looking at him with concern. "Did something happen?" Richard hesitated, but decided to tell her. He didn't want any more lies between them, not after everything they'd been through. He told her about the encounter in the parking garage, the veiled threats, the precautions he'd taken. Jennifer turned pale. She had thought that chapter was closed, that she would never have to look back, but the past had returned, and it was threatening the future they had worked so hard to build. Richard held her hand. "I won't let anything happen to you. Not to Bea, not to Gabriel. I'll protect you. Always." Jennifer squeezed his hand back. "I know. But we protect each other, okay? Don't do everything alone again. We're a team now." Richard nodded. They had learned their lesson. Together they were stronger. Together they could face anything. The days passed and nothing happened. There were no more appearances, no more threats. Richard began to relax little by little, thinking that maybe the man had given up, that maybe the show of force had been enough. And then Gabriel was born. It was a smooth delivery, on a Thursday morning before dawn. Richard was in the delivery room, holding Jennifer's hand, whispering words of encouragement, wiping the sweat from her brow. And when the baby was finally born, when his cry echoed through the room, Richard felt his chest swell with emotion. He was perfect, small, red, with his eyes squeezed shut and his fists clenched. Gabriel, his son, living proof that new beginnings were possible. Beatrice met her little brother the next day. She came into the hospital room with Mrs. Lewis, saw the baby in the bassinet next to her mother's bed, and froze. Then, slowly, she approached and touched Gabriel's tiny hand with her finger. "He's so small," she whispered, amazed. "Hi, Gabriel. I'm your big sister, and I'm going to take care of you always." Richard and Jennifer looked at each other, their eyes full of tears. They had created something beautiful, something real, something that was worth every mistake, every pain, every new beginning. They went home a few days later. The apartment was decorated with blue balloons and a welcome banner that Mrs. Lewis had hung on the door. The neighbor had prepared a week's worth of food, meals carefully organized in the fridge. Sonia had sent flowers. Paul had sent a fruit basket with a note, "For the most beautiful family in New York." The first few months with a newborn were challenging. Sleepless nights, endless diapers, cries that wouldn't stop, accumulated exhaustion. But Richard was there for all of it. He woke up in the middle of the night to change Gabriel, rocked him when Jennifer needed to rest, sang off-key lullabies that made Beatrice laugh. And it was on one of those nights, with Gabriel finally asleep in his crib, Beatrice snoring softly in the next room, and Jennifer passed out from exhaustion on the sofa, that Richard had a moment of absolute clarity. He looked around the small apartment, the living room with toys scattered about, the kitchen with baby bottles drying on the rack, the hallway with family photos hanging on the walls. It wasn't perfect, it was messy, it was noisy, it was tiring, but it was real, and it was theirs. And there, in that rare moment of silence, Richard finally made peace with his past. He accepted that he had made mistakes. He accepted that he had lost time. He accepted that he would never get back the years he had wasted. But he also accepted that the present was a gift, and that the future was a promise he would honor every single day. He sat on the sofa next to Jennifer, carefully pulling her closer so as not to wake her, and just watched her, her chest rising and falling with the deep breath of sleep, her messy hair falling across her face, her hand resting on her still slightly swollen belly. She was everything. She always had been. And he had almost lost it all to pride, to fear, to blindness. But he hadn't lost it. He had a second chance, and he was going to make the most of it. The following years were years of growth. Gabriel took his first steps, said his first words, got into his first mischief. Beatrice entered her teenage years full of ideas and plans. Jennifer became a curriculum coordinator at her school. Richard expanded his business in a balanced way, always keeping his family as the priority. And they never heard from the man who had threatened them again. Richard later found out through contacts that the guy had been arrested for extortion in another case. He was serving time, and he would probably be away for a long while. It was a liberation. The last ghost of the past had been exorcised. Now they could live without fear, without looking back, only forward. On a Sunday morning, 5 years after that life-changing phone call, the family was in the living room. Gabriel, now 4, was playing with toy cars on the floor. Beatrice, now 15, was studying for a test, while complaining about the amount of material. Jennifer was reading a book on the sofa, 6 months pregnant again, because life had decided to give them another surprise, this time a girl they would name Helena. And Richard was in the kitchen making pancakes, still lopsided, still burnt around the edges, but made with love. Beatrice looked up from her notebook and looked at her parents. She asked a question that caught them off guard. "Dad, Mom, do you regret anything?" Richard and Jennifer looked at each other. Then Jennifer answered with the honesty that always characterized her. "I regret not asking for help sooner, letting my pride blind me. But I don't regret anything that happened after, because everything we went through brought us here." Richard nodded. "I regret taking so long to realize what really mattered, putting work before you, but I learned, and now I know that family is everything." Beatrice smiled. "You guys were really stubborn, you know. You took way too long to get it together." Richard laughed. "That's true. We really were." "But you got it together," Gabriel shouted from the floor, without taking his eyes off his cars. "And now we're happy." And it was true, they were happy. Not in a perfect, idealized fairy tale way, but in a real, true way built with effort and daily choices. That night, after the kids were asleep, Richard and Jennifer stood on the small balcony, looking at the sky. Jennifer had her hand on her belly, feeling Helena kick. Richard was holding her, his chin resting on her head. "Thank you," Jennifer whispered. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For coming to get me that day. For staying." Richard held her tighter. "I'm the one who should be thanking you. For giving me a second chance. For believing we could start over. For building this with me." "Build in what?" Richard gestured to encompass the apartment, the family, everything. "This, a home, a family, a life worth living." Jennifer turned to face him. "We did it, didn't we?" "We did. And it wasn't easy. But it was worth every tear, every hardship, every new beginning." They kissed slowly, with the calm of people who know they have the rest of their lives ahead of them. And when they pulled apart, Jennifer had tears in her eyes. "I love you, Richard Miller. I love you." To Jennifer Miller, today, tomorrow, and always. And there, on that small balcony of a modest apartment in Queens, New York, a family that had been broken and mended continued to write its story. A story of mistakes and successes, of falls and new beginnings, of pride overcome and love regained. A story that proved it's never too late to come home, never too late to ask for forgiveness, never too late to start over. Because in the end, what matters isn't how much you have. It's who you have by your side. It's waking up every day and knowing, There are people who love you. It's having a place to come back to. It's having a family to call your own. And Richard, the entrepreneur who once thought wealth was measured in money, had finally learned the most important lesson of all. True wealth is waking up every day and knowing you are exactly where you're supposed to be. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Richard, Jennifer, and Beatrice has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of new beginnings and second chances, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what part of this story resonated with you the most. Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, stories of love, resilience, forgiveness, and family. We'll see you in the next episode with a new story that will stir your emotions.